Annie, how are you?
Sanjana, I'm good. How about you?
All well, all well. So 1 week to go for the exhibition. How are you feeling?
Yeah, very exciting, and I'm so looking forward to the show. It's so looking to the interaction around the show, basically. Yes.
Absolutely. So today we'll just discuss a bit about your concepts and process, so that the audience can get to know you better and can come to see the exhibition prepared with the knowledge of your sort of practice. The show is titled Codes of a Future, Traces of the Ancient. Now, the reason that I titled it that was because weirdly and interestingly, I could see so many aspects in your art that are from, sort of the ancient, sort of architecture, or maybe even like the way the pyramids are sort of coded in a particular manner that aligns with the stars, astrology, astronomy, and even small subtle things like our thumbprints, for example, or even atoms in our body. And so it's something that's sort of fundamental to human beings. But then it's also future because it also reminded me of like digital algorithms. The way I'm really bad with anything digital, but the way that any kind of programming looks. So it's very fascinating how there's this synergy between so many different aspects in such a simplistic work. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, I think it's fundamentally because I come from a certain background, and I had a certain kind of a temperament. Although I went to art school, and in art schools there are certain curriculums and certain structures and certain modules that you're being taught, like figurative drawings and things like that. But I was always attracted to a certain kind of a temperament about how do we organize, how do we quantify things, how do we look at certain patterns that are visible, like humongously everywhere, like they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere, so to say. Yeah. So it's there in nature, and from nature, of course, all of us draw inspiration. It has always been the case. Artists have always looked to nature for inspiration. And of course, then in architecture, in the building, in huge monumental buildings, and of course, it also is there in the landscape. And I think it's there everywhere, by which I mean it's there in a certain kind of an aesthetic component, which is very intrinsic in all of us. And in the very beginning, I wasn't really aware of, but also certain components of art history. Both Indian and I would say Western art history also drew me to this idea and to make a conscious decision about why I want to include this in my work. For instance, in Western art history, I would say the whole of Renaissance, who played such an important role in the emphasis on mathematics and mathematical ideas and perspective.
The golden ratio, for example. Right?
Of course, yes, the golden ratio, for example, and how the body, how it's kind of situated in the context of the pictorial space. So, of course, all of this was there. And more so in the context of India, the kind of temple architecture that we see everywhere, whether it's the Dravidian architecture or even it's in North India, the architectural has a certain kind of an element of pattern, which gets, it's like a fractal, which gets repeated again and again and again. So all of this was very intriguing, and so it has kind of seeped into my work gradually. Yeah.
So you do think that there is this sort of inherent some basic patterns that repeat in all the forms? It's almost like a subconscious thing that human beings tend to create.
Yes, absolutely. And it's like what you said about the title. I really like the title because it kind of explains my work so well. The two words I would say is ancient and future. These two things. Yeah. Extreme polarities, but they're like kind of flip sides of the same thing in many senses. That brings together in this title. I think as a summation, I really like that. And I think it's ancient because just from the very basic patterns, like in sunflower seeds, something, the way they're organized, the seeds are organized, or even in the pineapple fruit, the patterns, the way it's kind of, or even in the pentacles, like the way the leaves are arranged or the petals are arranged in a flower. So it's absolutely fundamental. It's a fundamental coding, which is part of our biology. It's part of our, human existence. It's there. And the other thing which you talked about, futuristic, I would say, many of you might know, or I don't know whether you know or not, but all of the codings that you see, whether the bar scales or the kind of codes that you scan, the Paytm centers.
And, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Your ATM cards, your mobile passwords and all. they're all coded in prime numbers. And so that because we have to arrive at a coding which is secure enough so that nobody can break it. So basically for that. And why prime numbers? Because the prime numbers are so unique. They come after a long gap. And so it's very hard to predict them. So basically, all of these kind of notions of which is embedded in certain kind of a knowledge. And of course, it's knowledge which people might think is very complicated, but actually it's not, I must say. It's so playful, it's so open-ended, and it's so fascinating. There's no end to it. And, so that's what draws me every time to these patterns. And I keep like extending and including them in my work. And of course I make they're not just informations for me. Like, of course I improvise on that and I make it my own, like in a subjective way. I explore them. And so there are different kinds of levels of interpretations that can be brought in the work in that sense.
It's also your imprint as an artist, right? So you're taking something that's sort of eternal, that's always existed and will always exist, but you're interpreting it in your own personal sort of subjective manner, which is
I think that's very important because it has to reflect an identity. It has to reflect the kind of background that has come that I have kind of journeyed through, Otherwise, it makes no sense because, of course, all this information is there. There's something new that I'm creating for that matter. I think the only contribution that I make is that I kind of minimize a lot of things. I kind of reduce a lot of things and I kind of exaggerate certain things by doing it over and over again.
And is that intuitive, Anni? Sorry to cut you off, but when you do that, is that intuitive?
It's both, I would say. It's so my process is both intuitive and is also very planned because planning is a huge part of the work, of the process in which I work. So I'd say when I begin, it's very intuitive. Like I just think about a lot of different things and I kind of make a lot of drawings and I play around those drawings. And after I've reached a certain point, then it's quite planned. My process is quite planned. It's quite neat. Like I know that I have to be going through certain stages. So that journey is based on my subjective interpretations and is also very planned. It's very objective also at times, yeah.
So you used an interesting word, polarity, which I actually have seen so much in your work in terms of on multiple levels, right? So in terms of the duality between the black and the white, right? Then also if you see it if you sort of zoom into the work, you see a different experience of it versus zooming out, right? Microscopic versus going out and seeing it in this sort of larger cosmic manner, which I think is very fascinating that there are so many dualities within the work itself. So what is the process of creating this? Because while it looks really simple on the surface, it's almost, I mean, whenever I've seen it, it's almost dynamic, it's moving, and it's like this optical illusion, this sort of curated chaos, but I'm sure there's a lot that goes behind the scenes here that we'd love to know more about.
Yeah, I love this idea of duality. I always like my things to be like looked at from up close. And when you look at them, like zoom out, they look completely different. So I like that idea of duality, and I like that idea of surprise, that my audience should be surprised every time and that my work should be active, it should like engage the audience at various different levels. So yeah, that's really important. In terms of the process, how I begin is first I make a drawing. I usually, obviously, I create a set of drawings, and many a times what I do is I do a separate drawings and then try to bring them together by overlapping. And then sometimes I also write algorithms on the computer. And then those algorithms, I try to use certain programs called Python, an application, and then try to see in the computer, how does it look like? And then I kind of scale it up using, so I use a lot of beam compasses. I have these compasses which I get made. It's called a beam compass. And that beam compass allows me to kind of merge. So basically I first create parallel grids, vertical and horizontal grids for my compass, for my composition. Okay. And then using the compass, I create the spirals because the spirals then join at a certain point. It's very mathematical in terms of the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
And after that, it's also very minimal in that sense that I only use one color, which is black. I don't use like white on black, which usually people might think of when they see the work in person at first glance, but usually I use the black and I leave out blank areas on the canvas. So the white that you see is the left out areas. Now that itself is a very tricky practice, because once you cover the white, I don't go back. So you need a lot of precision, you need a lot of concentration when you're doing it, because once you made an error or you filled an area, you can't go back. So
I mean, just out of curiosity, technically you could, I'm just, again, you could put on the white dot where you probably covered it by mistake, but do you see your art and your process as sort of a sacred, I guess, ritual where you don't want to go back, even if you could technically put, do you just want it to go and you think it's the natural process of creation?
Yeah, that's correct. It's very much a spiritual process for me. It's very much that I want whatever has happened to be visible to the audience. So I don't want to make it like artificially, I don't want to make it that artificial, in the sense I want my errors to be visible to the audience. So yeah. I want my work practice to be meditative. It's almost like a Zen philosophy in some senses. I mean, although I don't practice that in a very deep sense, but I would say it's somewhat like that. It's inclined towards that. That you're just alive at that moment, and you let that moment drive you, and you don't cover it up with anything. You're being just raw, and you're being, original. You just submit to that moment, like as an original person.
Exactly. You submit to the process of it. There's no sort of undoing or going back.
Yeah, I think that's really important for me.
Absolutely. So, so because it's so minimal and it's so simplistic, going back to what I said about the ancient, I think that it's so fundamental to human beings to want to find a very basic sort of rhythm and the order and the beauty in everything we visually experience, right? Especially visual art. And, going back to temple architecture and art, I think that if you see your work, you mentioned to me that, there are a lot of influences of like tribal folk art, and even the basic sort of geometrical shapes that temple architecture uses, right? Circles and squares and very repetitive patterns. So, tell me a bit more about how that's influenced you as an artist.
Yeah. So I think there were two basic geometrical forms, one the square and the circle, which is something that has intrigued me endlessly. I'm still exploring it. And the third is the overlap of them, and then a diagonal that gets created. So this is the core of the forms that I engage with. And most of these forms have come with all mostly the Linga temples that I've visited, the Shiva Linga temples. And when I look at the way that the central part of the temple is organized, so usually a square, and then when it leads to the Garbhagriha, sometimes because you do what is called as the circumambulation. All of us practice in the temple. Rituals that we do a circumambulation. Basically, you go around the temple, you just circle around the temple. So I think this idea and this practice of just visiting the Linga temples and then doing it, and also like a lot of, as you were talking about, like a lot of folk and tribal art forms. So I grew up in Jharkhand, and that's an area in Hazaribagh, which is an area in Jharkhand. So there was this folk art form, which is called the Kovar and the Sorai. Now they use very geometrical patterns, which they say are kind of continuous forms from the Chalcolithic period, so really ancient forms. And these forms are very geometric. If you look at them, they are mostly like square, circle, and sometimes triangle. But basically, I'm more fascinated with the square and the circle. I don't know why, but there is this curiosity. And I think just by playing around these forms, there's endless combinations of patterns that I can create. And also, I've done an extensive research on the floor art tradition from Tamil Nadu called Kolam. And if you look at the Kolam, they have these geometrical and they have this rotational symmetry, which tends towards either a circle or the circle kind of forms within the square. So it's either an overlap or a combination of square and circles. It's very hard to explain all of this without the visuals, but basically, it all is based on this idea of continuation of the form, which obviously the circle allows you because it's like an endless space, and it's an ever expanding circumambulatory space. So yeah, these are some of the pinpoints that I can think about. But of course, it's an endless topic, and there's so much to talk about, like in terms of the depth and the intensity of all of these motifs.
No, absolutely, absolutely. No, I mean it's very sort of, as I said again, there's a harmonious aspect to these simple shapes that we see all around us. There's almost like a synergy that we feel, and your art, I think, is something that people can very easily connect with because of that very simplistic, almost primal way of presenting something that's there everywhere around us, but we aren't even conscious about it until we interact with it. It's almost soothing. It's your art is soothing, but it's also dynamic. It transforms, or rather draws the viewer into the art. So how would you want your viewers to engage now with the show around the corner? Do you want them to sort of have an idea of all these intellectual concepts beforehand, or do you want them to come in completely blank and experience the art first? How do you as an artist sort of want them to see and perceive your art?
Well, what has always been satisfying so far has been that people of all age groups and people of all gender types and people of all backgrounds have appreciated my work without knowing the mathematical context so far. And I'm so glad, because the moment that people look at the work, they just say, it's not an exaggeration, but many of times people have come to me and they've said that they've loved the work. And that's what I want. I just want that people should feel a connection with the work. Of course, the intellectual idea is important for me because it drives me as a person. It's my personal choice. It's something that I draw inspiration and energy from. But for the audience, I don't want them to get into all of these layers if they're not interested. It's the experience that matters to them. And I just want them to enjoy it whichever way they want to enjoy, and should be approachable to everyone without these intellectual layers.
Absolutely. So I remember the first time. No, sorry, please continue.
I want it to be a sensorial experience that's really important. It has to engage their senses. That's all. That's the crux.
So I was saying that the first time I interacted with your art was at 079 Stories in Ahmedabad. And I remember sort of entering the gallery. I didn't read the concept note first. I just walked around, and it really did pull me in. It really did sort of, I was very intrigued by it. And, you go close and you see it, and then you go far, and it's a whole experience. It's beautiful. And I'm quite excited for everybody to see the art finally next week. So thank you, Anni. Any last sort of comments or thoughts or ideas?
Well, I'm just looking forward to everyone. And as you said, we are just so eager. And, because the artist doesn't create for oneself. We create for, everyone. We want everyone to be a part of this whole process. And now, since so I'm just looking forward to everyone to engage and to respond. And and I'm so glad the way it's been curated. And I really have to thank you for that, because the way the sensitivity of the context, so it's not lost in the words that you're expressing. In fact, you've kind of brought about the essence of what I've been trying to say. So I'm really glad. And also the title, I really love the title, the way you put everything, that the way it summarizes and kind of holds the intensity of my ideas. So I'm really thankful.
I'm so glad. Such a pleasure working with you, Anni. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sanjana. Thank you.